I've been a conservation officer with the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources for 14 years, assigned to a district in the Daniel Boone National Forest that covers approximately 40,000 acres of the most rugged terrain in eastern Kentucky. The work is primarily enforcement, investigating poaching complaints, checking hunting and fishing licenses, monitoring wildlife populations, and patrolling the backcountry during hunting season when the mountains fill up with people carrying firearms and varying degrees of judgment. The district includes some of the most remote land in the state, hollows and ridges so steep and heavily timbered that you can walk for 8 hours and not cross a road or a trail or see any sign that humans have been in the area within living memory. I know this terrain the way anyone knows terrain. They've walked professionally for 14 years, by feel and by landmark, and by the accumulated knowledge of 1,000 patrols through the same drainages in every season and every weather condition. February of 2022, I was investigating a poaching complaint along a creek drainage about 6 miles from the nearest maintained road, deep in the interior of the forest. A hunting party had reported finding the remains of a deer that had been killed and partially butchered out of season, the carcass left in the creek bottom with the backstraps and hindquarters removed, and everything else left for the coyotes. Poaching is common enough in the backcountry that I investigate several cases a year, and the pattern here was consistent with someone who knew how to take the best meat quickly and leave before they could be caught. I'd hiked in early that morning, following a creek drainage that provided the most direct route to the reported location, arriving at the site around 10 o'clock. The deer carcass was where the hunters had described it, in a flat section of the creek bottom where the water widened into a shallow pool. It had been there for maybe 3 or 4 days based on the condition of the remains. The cuts were clean, made with a sharp blade, the work of someone who had butchered deer before. Standard poaching, nothing unusual about the kill itself. What was unusual was the snow. We'd gotten 4 inches of fresh snow 2 nights before my visit, a clean blanket that covered everything and that held impressions with the particular clarity that fresh snow provides, every track and every print preserved with photographic precision. The snow around the carcass showed tracks: coyote, turkey vulture, the expected scavengers, and footprints. Human footprints, barefoot. I knelt beside the first print and looked at it for a long time, longer than I'd normally spend examining a track, because what I was seeing didn't correspond to anything in my 14 years of tracking experience. The print was human in basic shape, 5 toes and a heel and an arch, pressed into 4 inches of snow to a depth that suggested significant weight, probably an adult, but the details were wrong in ways that accumulated into something deeply unsettling. The toes were splayed, not the moderate spreading that bare feet produce when they're unshod, the natural expansion that happens when toes aren't confined by shoes. These were splayed wide, with visible gaps between each toe, the kind of splay you see in people who have never worn footwear, whose feet have developed without the compressive shaping that shoes impose from childhood. The gaps between the toes were pronounced enough that each toe made a distinct impression in the snow, 5 separate marks arranged in an arc that was wider than any shoe-wearing foot would produce. The print showed no heel strike. In normal human walking, the heel contacts the ground first, and then the foot rolls forward onto the ball and the toes. This creates a characteristic impression where the heel print is deeper than the toe print, the weight concentrated at the point of initial contact. These prints were flat, the entire sole contacting the ground simultaneously, uniform depth from heel to toe, the way an animal walks, weight distributed evenly across the entire foot. Whatever had made these prints was walking with a gait that didn't involve the heel-to-toe rolling motion that every shoe-wearing human uses, a gait that suggested either a profound difference in biomechanics or a lifetime of walking in a way that humans typically don't. And the stride length was wrong. I measured it, heel to heel, the way I'd measure any track sequence. The stride was approximately 42 inches, which is too long for a normal walking pace and too short for a running pace. It fell in between, a gait that corresponded to no standard human locomotion pattern I'd been trained to identify. Not walking, not running, not jogging. Something else, a way of moving that covered ground efficiently at a pace that didn't match any category in my tracking manual. I followed the prints. The track led upstream along the creek, the prints clear and consistent in the fresh snow, each one showing the same flat contact and the same wide toe splay and the same anomalous stride length. I followed them through heavy timber, up a grade that would have winded me at a normal hiking pace, and the prints showed no change in stride or depth, no indication that the grade affected whatever was making them. The track crossed the creek 3 times, not at the shallow crossings where I would have forded, but straight across, walking through water that was running at maybe 2 feet deep and that I knew from experience was 34 degrees, cold enough to produce pain within seconds and numbness within minutes. The prints went into the water on one bank and came out on the other without any change in stride or any indication of hesitation, as if the creek were no more obstacle than the flat ground on either side. The track went over a rock face, a section of exposed sandstone, maybe 30 feet of angled rock that rose at about 40 degrees from the creek bottom to the ridge above. I had to go around it, detouring 100 yards downstream to find a route that I could climb with my hands free. The prints went straight up the rock, the toes gripping the stone in a way that left scuff marks visible even on the hard surface, the foot flexing and conforming to the rock in a manner that suggested a prehensile capability, toes that could grip and hold in ways that modern human feet, weakened by decades of footwear, cannot. About a mile from the carcass, the track passed within 20 yards of a cabin. It was a hunting cabin, one I knew, used by a party from Lexington who leased the surrounding property for deer season. I could see the cabin through the trees, smoke rising from the chimney, a truck parked in front. The track passed the cabin on the uphill side, 20 yards from the back wall, close enough that whatever made it would have been visible from the cabin's rear window if anyone had been looking. I stopped at the cabin and knocked. The hunting party was inside, 3 men, and they were in a particular mood that I recognized immediately as the residue of a bad night. They looked tired and unsettled in the way that people look when they've been frightened and are trying to convince themselves they weren't. I asked about the poaching report, and they confirmed the details, and then one of them mentioned the dogs. They had 2 coonhounds, experienced dogs, animals that had tracked bear and coyote through these mountains for years without showing fear of anything. The previous night, both dogs had refused to leave the porch. They'd been outside when darkness fell, doing what hunting dogs do, and around 8 o'clock they'd both come to the porch and pressed against the cabin door and whined until someone let them in. Once inside, they'd gone to the corner furthest from the back wall and stayed there all night, trembling, refusing to eat, refusing to go out, exhibiting the particular shutdown that dogs display when they encounter something that exceeds their capacity for threat assessment, something so far outside their experience that their only response is to withdraw and wait for it to pass. The hunters had heard nothing, seen nothing. The dogs had simply refused to go outside, and in the morning they were normal again, eating and moving and showing no residual effects except a reluctance to go behind the cabin, near the tree line where the track I was following had passed 20 yards from the wall. I continued following the prints beyond the cabin. They maintained their consistency, the same stride, the same flat contact, the same wide splay, moving through the forest with a purpose and a direction that suggested not wandering but travel, something going somewhere specific, with the confidence of an entity that knew exactly where it was heading. The track climbed to the ridge above the creek drainage and followed it northwest for maybe half a mile before descending to a rock overhang, a sandstone shelf that created a shallow shelter about 15 feet wide and 6 feet deep, the kind of natural overhang that the forest produces where erosion has undercut a resistant layer of stone. The prints ended at the overhang. The snow didn't reach beneath the rock, and the ground was frozen hard, a surface that held no impressions. Beyond the overhang, the terrain was rocky, exposed sandstone and frozen ground that would show no tracks even if something had walked across it. The trail simply stopped, ending at a shelter that showed signs of use but no signs of current occupation. The ground beneath the overhang was smooth, swept, or worn, and the back wall of the shelter showed soot staining that could have been from fires, though the staining was old and no ash or charcoal was visible. I searched the area around the overhang for an hour. I found no continuation of the track, no prints in any direction, no disturbance in the snow beyond the single line of approach, no indication that whatever had walked to this shelter had walked away from it. It had arrived and it had stopped, and it had gone somewhere that didn't leave marks in the snow. I filed my report on the poaching incident. I documented the deer carcass and the location and the clean cuts that suggested an experienced hand. I did not include the footprints, not because I doubted what I'd seen, but because what I'd seen didn't fit inside the categories that official reports accommodate: Barefoot prints in February snow aren't a wildlife violation. Anomalous gait patterns aren't a game law infraction. Dogs that won't leave a porch aren't evidence of anything that the department has a form for. I went back 3 days later, after the snow had melted. The creek drainage looked the same. The cabin was empty. The rock overhang was dry and quiet. No prints, no tracks, no sign that anything had passed through except the memory I carried and the photographs I'd taken and the measurements I'd recorded in my personal notebook rather than in the official file. I've been back to that drainage many times since. I patrol it regularly, the way I patrol every section of my district, with the professional attention that the work requires. I've never found those prints again. I've never found anything that matches what I saw in the snow that February morning, the flat-footed, wide-toed, wrong-gated track of something that walked barefoot through freezing water and over rock faces and past dogs that wouldn't leave their porch and up to a shelter that it entered and from which it didn't emerge. But I've talked to other officers, quietly, carefully, in the way that professionals talk about things that don't fit inside their professional vocabulary. And some of them have nodded. Some of them have said yes. Some of them have described prints they've found in their own districts, in other sections of the Daniel Boone, or in other forests across the Appalachian chain, prints that are human but not human, that show feet that have never worn shoes, and a gait that doesn't match any pattern in the manual, and a comfort with terrain and temperature that goes beyond what any modern human should possess. Something walks these mountains barefoot in February. Something that moves through snow and creek water and over rock without hesitation or difficulty. Something that passes within yards of occupied cabins and frightens dogs that fear nothing else. Something that sleeps in rock shelters and walks on feet that have never known shoes, and that moves with a gait that is neither walking nor running but something in between. Something efficient and purposeful and wrong. I don't know what it is. I don't know how many there are. I don't know where they go when the rock overhang is empty and the snow shows no tracks leading away. But I know the prints are real. I measured them and photographed them and followed them for a mile through snow that held their shape with the honest precision of fresh powder. And the prints told me something about these mountains that 14 years of professional experience hadn't taught me. We're not alone in here. And whatever walks with us walks barefoot and wrong, and without any sign that it cares whether we know it's there. My grandfather was not a man who told stories for entertainment. He was a coal miner from McDowell County, West Virginia, a man who went into the earth 5 days a week for 23 years and came home black with dust and said almost nothing about what he did down there. He had the particular silence of men who work in dangerous conditions and who learn early that talking about the danger doesn't reduce it, and that the people who haven't been underground can't understand it, and that the people who have don't need it explained. He went to work. He came home. He washed the coal dust off his skin in a tub on the back porch, and he ate dinner, and he sat in his chair, and he went to bed, and he did it again the next day, and the day after that for 23 years until the company closed the operation in 1971, and he retired to the same chair, and the same silence, and the same economy of words that had defined his working life. He told me stories occasionally when I was young enough to ask and he was in the mood to answer. Most of them were practical, descriptions of the work itself, the mechanics of cutting coal and shoring tunnels and moving equipment through spaces that were often too small to stand upright in. He told them the way a carpenter would describe building a house, with attention to process and material and the satisfaction of work done correctly. He didn't dramatize, he didn't embellish. If anything, he understated, stripping the stories of the fear and the discomfort that must have been constant in a profession that killed men regularly and damaged the ones it didn't kill. But there was one story he told only once. I was 17. It was a Saturday night in November, late, my grandmother already in bed. The two of us sitting in the living room of their house in Welch, with the television off and the wood stove ticking, and the particular quiet that settled over the hollow after 10 o'clock, when the neighbors' lights went out, the road went dark. I don't remember what prompted it. I may have asked a question about the mines, or he may have simply decided that the time and the conditions were right for telling something he'd been carrying for decades, and that he needed to set down before it got too heavy. He started talking in a voice I'd never heard him use, lower and more careful than his normal speech, the voice of a man choosing his words with the precision of someone who knows that the wrong word will make the story sound like fiction, and that the truth of it depends on the telling being exact. He said the mine he worked, the Pinnacle Creek operation, went deep into the mountain on multiple levels. The tunnels following the coal seams wherever they led, branching and descending and connecting in a network that extended for miles underground. The active sections, where the miners worked, were lit and ventilated and maintained with the infrastructure that the company provided, the rail lines and the power cables, and the timber shoring that kept the mountain from collapsing on the men who were cutting its insides out. But beyond the active sections, behind the timber barriers that the company erected when a seam was exhausted or a tunnel became too unstable to work, the mine continued. Miles of abandoned tunnel, unlit, unventilated, sealed off from the working mine by barriers that were meant to prevent access, but that were built from wood, not steel, and that deteriorated over time the way all wood deteriorates, the moisture and the pressure, and the slow chemistry of underground decay, weakening the barriers until they were more suggestion than obstruction. My grandfather said the sounds started in the early 1960s, though some of the old-timers claimed they'd been hearing them since the 1940s. They came from the deep sections, from behind the barriers that sealed the abandoned tunnels, and they came most often on the night shifts when the mine was quietest, and the machines were down, and the only sounds were the creaking of the mountain, and the dripping of water, and the breathing of men working in the dark. Movement. That was the first thing. The sound of something moving on the other side of a timber barrier, not the random shifting of loose rock or the scurrying of rats, which were common enough in the mines, and which every miner recognized and ignored. This was different. This was deliberate. Footsteps, or something like footsteps, moving along the abandoned tunnel on the other side of the wood, moving with a purpose that suggested not the random wandering of an animal, but the directed travel of something that knew where it was going. Breathing. Ragged and fast, the kind of breathing you hear from a person or an animal that has been exerting itself, panting, pulling air in short, quick gulps. The breathing would come close to the barrier and stop, as if whatever was breathing had pressed itself against the wood and was listening, the way my grandfather and the other miners were listening from their side, both parties separated by a few inches of rotting timber, both aware of the other, neither willing to be the first to confirm what the sound implied. And voices. My grandfather used the word carefully, qualifying it immediately by saying they weren't voices in any way that he understood the word. They were vocalizations, rapid and high-pitched, produced by something that had a throat and a mouth and the physical equipment to generate complex sounds, but that wasn't using those sounds to form words. The vocalizations had the rhythm of communication, the back-and-forth pattern of two or more entities exchanging information, responding to each other, coordinating. But there was no language in it. No words, no structure that a human ear could parse into meaning, just sound, fast and urgent and deeply unsettling in the way that sound is unsettling when it comes from the dark and from behind a barrier and from something that you can hear but can't see, and that shouldn't be there. My grandfather said the miners talked about it among themselves but never to the company. This was the 1960s in McDowell County, and the mines were the only employment, and you didn't give the company reasons to think you were unreliable or imaginative, or the kind of man who heard things in the dark and couldn't work because of it. The miners who'd been working the deep sections the longest had their own understanding of what was behind the barriers, an understanding that was never formalized or spoken about directly, but that informed the way they behaved underground, the rules they followed that weren't in any safety manual, and that new miners learned by observation rather than instruction. Don't work alone in the deep sections. Don't stay past your shift if you're working near a barrier. Don't leave food where it can be found. Don't make unnecessary noise near the sealed tunnels. And never, under any circumstances, open a barrier. The old-timers had a theory that my grandfather relayed without endorsement or denial, in the flat tone of a man who is reporting what he was told rather than what he believes. They said that in the early years of mining in McDowell County, before the regulations and the safety standards and the company infrastructure, men went into the mines and sometimes didn't come out. Not killed in collapses or explosions. The deaths that were documented and reported disappeared. Went into a section of tunnel and didn't return. Their absence noted but not investigated, because the mines were vast and the tunnels branched in every direction, and a man who wandered into an unmapped section could walk for miles underground without finding his way back. The old-timers said some of those men survived, found water in the underground streams that permeated the limestone, found food in the rats and the insects and whatever organic matter the water carried, found shelter in the tunnels where the temperature was constant and the walls blocked the wind, and the darkness was absolute and permanent, and they stayed. Not because they couldn't find the way out, but because the darkness changed them, altered something in their minds or their biology that made the surface world intolerable, that made the light painful and the open spaces terrifying, and the presence of normal humans a threat rather than a comfort. They went feral. They adapted to the underground the way any organism adapts to its environment, over years and decades and generations. The original lost miners giving way to children born in darkness who had never seen light, who navigated by sound and touch, and a spatial awareness that the sighted world had no use for, who developed their own communication, their own social structure, their own way of living that was as alien to the surface world as the surface world was to them. My grandfather didn't say he believed this. He didn't say he didn't. He said the sounds were real. He said every miner who worked the deep sections at Pinnacle Creek heard them at some point, and that the ones who heard them most often were the ones who worked closest to the barriers, and that the sounds were loudest and most frequent in the weeks before the company decided to seal the deep sections permanently. He told me about the sealing. It happened in 1967, officially described as a safety measure related to structural instability in the abandoned sections. The company brought in heavy equipment and sealed the barriers with concrete, replacing the rotting timber with walls of poured stone that were 6 inches thick and reinforced with rebar. The work was done quickly, over a weekend when the mine was shut down, and the miners who came back on Monday found the deep sections closed off permanently, the concrete walls smooth and solid where the timber barriers had been. My grandfather said the sounds continued for a while after the concrete went in, muffled now, filtered through 6 inches of stone, but audible if you pressed your ear to the wall, which some miners did, and which my grandfather did once and never did again. He said what he heard through the concrete was the sound of hands. Many hands, pressed flat against the other side of the wall, moving across the surface, feeling the stone that had replaced the wood, exploring the barrier that had changed from something they could work through, given time, to something they couldn't. The hands moved across the concrete for weeks, he said, and then they stopped. And after that, the deep sections were silent, and the miners worked their shifts and cut their coal, and went home and didn't talk about what had been sealed behind 6 inches of concrete in the abandoned tunnels of the Pinnacle Creek mine. The mine closed in 1971. The entrances were sealed, the equipment was removed, the company moved on. The mountain closed over the mine the way it closes over everything, slowly, patiently, the forest reclaiming the surface, while the tunnels below held their darkness and their silence and whatever was living in them when the concrete went in. My grandfather died in 2004. He never mentioned the story again after that November night, and I never asked, because the voice he'd used to tell it was a voice that didn't invite follow-up questions. It was the voice of a man who had carried something for decades and had set it down and didn't want to pick it up again. I went to McDowell County a few years after he died. I found the Pinnacle Creek mine site, or what was left of it. The entrances were sealed with concrete caps, standard mine closure procedure, the surface overgrown with 40 years of forest growth. I stood at the sealed portal and looked at the concrete and thought about what was on the other side. Miles of tunnel extending into the mountain, abandoned for over 50 years, dark and silent and sealed at every exit. Or not silent. That's what I can't stop thinking about. The concrete went in at the barriers in 1967. The mine entrances were sealed in 1971, but between those dates, the mine was still open. Whatever was living in the deep sections had 4 years between the internal sealing and the external sealing, 4 years to explore the newly vacant tunnels, to move through the sections that the miners had abandoned, to expand their territory from the deep sections into the rest of the mine. And when the entrances were sealed in 1971, whatever was inside was sealed in with them. 50 years in the dark. 50 years in a closed system with no light and no exit, and the particular resources that a coal mine provides. The water that seeps through the limestone and the organisms that live in that water, and the rats that were sealed in too, and whatever else survives underground when the surface world forgets what's down there. I think about adaptation. I think about what 50 years of total darkness does to a population that was already adapted to the underground, that had already developed communication and navigation and survival strategies for a lightless environment. I think about generations born and lived and died in those tunnels, never seeing the sun, never breathing surface air, never knowing that a world existed above the rock ceiling of the only space they'd ever occupied. And I think about the concrete, the seals at the mine entrances, which were poured in 1971 and which have been sitting in the West Virginia weather for 50 years, freezing and thawing and absorbing moisture and slowly deteriorating the way all concrete deteriorates when it's not maintained. The rebar rusting and expanding and cracking the stone from within, the freeze-thaw cycles opening fissures that widen a fraction of an inch every year. 50 years of deterioration, 50 years of cracks widening and concrete weakening, and the mountain slowly, patiently opening what the company closed. And I wonder if the concrete is still holding. And I wonder if something has been testing it, pressing against the barriers the way my grandfather heard hands pressing against the walls in 1967, feeling for the weakness, the crack, the place where 50 years of weather have done what 50 years of hands could not. I don't go back to McDowell County. I don't visit the mine site. I don't stand at the sealed portals and listen the way my grandfather listened at the concrete walls, because I don't want to hear the hands. And I don't want to find out that the concrete, after 50 years, has finally let them through. I've been teaching at the elementary school in Mingo County for 11 years, which is long enough to know every family in the district by name and most of them by history, the generational stories that accumulate in small mountain communities where the same families have been living in the same hollows for 150 years. Mingo County is one of the poorest counties in West Virginia, which makes it one of the poorest places in America, a fact that the statistics capture, but that the statistics don't explain. The poverty here isn't just economic, it's geographic, embedded in the terrain itself, in the steep hollows and the narrow roads and the distance between everything, the miles of mountain between a house and a school, between a family and a doctor, between a child and the kind of life that children in other places take for granted. I teach here because I grew up here and because these kids need teachers who understand that a child who falls asleep in class may not be lazy but may be sharing a bed with 3 siblings in a house without heat, and that a child who doesn't come to school may not be truant but may be dealing with something that the school system doesn't have a form for. Caleb was one of my second graders, a quiet boy, small for his age, with the particular watchfulness of a child who has learned to observe before acting, who takes in the world with large eyes and processes it internally before offering any response. He lived with his grandmother, a woman named Doris, in a hollow about 4 miles from the school, up a road that was paved for the first 2 miles and gravel for the rest, ending at a small frame house that sat at the base of a ridge where the hollow narrowed to a crease in the mountain and the forest came down to the yard on 3 sides. Caleb's mother was out of the picture in the way that mothers in these counties sometimes are. The specific circumstances known to the community but not discussed with outsiders. His father had never been in the picture at all. Doris was raising him with the fierce, quiet competence of a mountain woman who had been taking care of things her entire life and who didn't need help and didn't ask for it. Caleb was a good student, not exceptional, not struggling, just steady and present, and engaged in the way that tells you a child is being cared for at home, that someone is making sure he eats breakfast and does his homework and goes to bed at a reasonable hour. His attendance was reliable. He came every day, got off the bus every afternoon, and did what 7-year-olds do in the mountains, which is exist in the overlap between the structured world of school and the unstructured world of hollers and creeks and woods that start at the edge of the yard. He stopped coming on a Tuesday in October. Wednesday, no Caleb. Thursday, no Caleb. I called the house phone that Doris used, a landline because cell service didn't reach the hollow, no answer. I called twice more on Thursday, nothing. On Friday, after school, I drove out. The road to Doris's house climbed through the kind of terrain that defines Mingo County, steep ridges covered in hardwood forest that was showing the first real color of autumn, the maples turning orange, and the oaks going brown, and the understory thinning as the season drew the leaves down and opened the sight lines between the trees. The gravel section of the road was rough, washed out in places from recent rain, and the last half-mile was barely a road at all, a track through the woods that ended at a turnaround in front of the house. The house was a small frame structure, maybe 4 rooms, with vinyl siding and a metal roof, and a porch that ran across the front. It was neat and maintained, the yard mowed, the porch swept, the kind of house that Doris would keep because keeping a house was a form of self-respect that she practiced without discussion. The hollow behind the house rose steeply, the forest starting maybe 50 feet from the back wall, the trees climbing the ridge in dense ranks that blocked the sky in summer, and that, in October, were beginning to thin enough to show the ridge line above. Doris was on the porch when I pulled up. She was sitting in a chair, not rocking, just sitting, watching the road with the particular stillness of someone who has been watching for a while and who is not waiting for anything good. I got out of the car and walked to the porch and said hello and asked about Caleb, and watched her face do something that I recognized from 11 years of working with families in this county. She was deciding what to tell me, not whether to lie. Doris wasn't a liar, but how much truth to offer, how much of what she was experiencing could be translated into language that a school teacher would accept without deciding she was crazy. She said Caleb was fine. He was inside. He was watching television. He didn't want to come to school. I asked why. She looked at me for a long time, her eyes moving from my face to the tree line behind the house and back, and then she said it was because of the children in the woods. I asked what children. She said they'd started coming about 2 weeks ago. At first she thought they were kids from one of the other hollows, playing in the woods the way children in these mountains play, ranging through the forest in the hours between school and dark, exploring and climbing, and doing the things that unsupervised children do when they have thousands of acres of woodland at their disposal. She heard them first, sounds in the woods above the house after sunset, movement in the undergrowth, the crack of branches, the rustle of leaves being displaced by something moving through them. She didn't think much of it. Children play in the woods. The sounds were unremarkable. Then Caleb saw them. He was in his bedroom, which was at the back of the house, the window facing the ridge. He came out of his room one night about 10 days before my visit and told Doris there were kids in the yard. She went to his window and looked and saw shapes at the tree line, maybe 40 feet from the house, low to the ground, moving along the edge of the forest where the mowed yard met the trees. She thought they were dogs at first. They were on all fours, moving with a quick, fluid gait that was closer to an animal's locomotion than a human's, covering ground with an efficiency that suggested bodies accustomed to that posture, not children playing at being animals, but something that moved on 4 limbs as its natural and preferred means of travel. She turned on the porch light. The shapes stopped. She could see them more clearly in the light that reached the tree line, and what she saw was not dogs. They were children, or they had the approximate size and shape of children, but they were naked and filthy, and their hair was long and matted, and they were positioned on the ground with their hands and feet planted flat, their backs level, their heads raised and turned toward the house in a posture that was alert and watchful, and that showed no surprise at the light, no startled response, no reaction that suggested the light was unexpected or unwelcome. They watched the house. Doris watched them. The moment lasted maybe 30 seconds before they turned and moved back into the trees with a speed that was startling, not running upright but scuttling, the 4-limbed gait carrying them into the undergrowth and up the ridge with a fluency that said they knew this terrain the way a fish knows water. They came back every night after that. Doris saw them from the windows and from the porch, always after dark, always near the tree line, always on all fours. She counted at least 4, possibly 5, ranging in size from what she estimated was a 6-year-old to a teenager. They moved in a loose group, not single file but not randomly, a formation that suggested coordination without hierarchy, the way a pack moves when every member knows its role. They came closer each night. The first week they stayed at the tree line. By the second week, they were in the yard, moving across the mowed grass on their hands and feet with a silence that Doris said was the most disturbing thing about them, more disturbing than the posture or the speed or the filth. They made no sound, no vocalization, no breathing that she could hear, no rustle of the grass beneath them. They moved through the yard like shadows, like projections, like things that occupied space without interacting with it. Caleb had stopped sleeping. He'd seen them from his window on multiple nights, and the sight had done something to him that Doris couldn't fix with reassurance or explanation. He wouldn't go to his room after dark. He slept on the couch in the living room with every light in the house on, and the television running and Doris sitting in her chair within arm's reach. He wasn't hysterical. He wasn't crying or screaming or exhibiting the theatrical fear that children sometimes perform when they want attention. He was quiet, still, watchful. The fear in him was deep and settled. The fear of a child who has seen something real and knows it's real, and knows that the adults around him can't make it not real. I asked Doris if she'd called anyone, the sheriff, the neighbors, anyone. She looked at me with an expression that contained both patience and pity, the look of a woman explaining something obvious to someone who should already know it. She said calling the sheriff would mean telling the sheriff that there were wild children in the woods behind her house, and that the sheriff would come and find nothing and make a note in a file and leave, and that the children would come back that night and the night after, and she'd be the woman who calls the sheriff about things the sheriff can't see. She said the neighbors knew. She said people in the hollow had been seeing them for weeks, hearing them in the woods, finding signs of their presence in the morning, footprints in disturbed ground, and the remains of small animals that had been caught and eaten raw. Nobody was calling the sheriff. Nobody was calling anyone. The hollow was handling it the way hollows in Mingo County handle things that don't fit inside the official world, which is quietly, privately, with locked doors and porch lights, and the understanding that some problems don't have solutions, only accommodations. I sat on that porch with Doris for an hour. I asked every question I could think of. Where did they come from? She didn't know. How long had they been in the area? She'd heard talk from people further up the hollow who said they'd been seeing signs for months, maybe longer. Were they local children, runaways, kids from one of the deeper hollows where the families were poorest and the supervision was thinnest? She shook her head. She said these weren't children who had been lost or abandoned. She said these were children who had been raised in the woods, who had never lived in a house, who moved and behaved like animals because they had been living as animals for their entire lives, or for so long that the distinction had ceased to matter. I went home that evening and sat in my kitchen and tried to apply my training and my experience to what Doris had told me. I'm a mandatory reporter. If there are children living in the woods without shelter or supervision, I'm legally obligated to report it to Child Protective Services. But what would I report? That an elderly woman in a remote hollow says she's seen feral children running on all fours near her house at night? The report would be filed. An investigation would be opened. A social worker would drive to the hollow and find nothing, because whatever was living in those woods wasn't going to present itself to a social worker with a clipboard and a county vehicle. I went back to the hollow the following week. Caleb still wasn't in school. Doris was on the porch. She looked worse, the fatigue of sustained vigilance showing in her face and her posture. She said they'd been on the porch the night before. Not in the yard, not at the tree line. On the porch. She'd heard the boards creak under weight that she couldn't see in the dark, the soft compression of old wood under bare feet moving across the surface, and she'd sat in the living room with every light on and the door locked and listened to something, walk the length of her porch and stop at the window and breathe against the glass. I filed a report. I reported it as a concern for child welfare, possible unsupervised minors in a remote area. The county sent someone to investigate. They found nothing. No children, no footprints, no evidence of habitation in the woods above the hollow. The case was closed. Caleb came back to school in November. Doris brought him herself, driving the truck to the school for the first time rather than putting him on the bus. And she walked him to my classroom and stood in the doorway and looked at me and said they left. She said the children in the woods had moved on sometime in late October, the sounds stopping, the nightly visits ending, the hollow returning to the normal quiet that it had held before they arrived. She didn't look relieved. She looked like a woman who knew that they left wasn't the same as they're gone, and that the woods above her hollow were the same woods that connected to every other hollow in the county, and that whatever had been living in them was still living in them, somewhere, moving through the mountains the way mountain people have always moved, following the ridges and the drainages and the hollows that form the hidden highway system of the Appalachian interior. Caleb never talked about it. Not to me, not to the other students, not that I know of. He came back to school and did his work, and sat at his desk with the same quiet watchfulness that had always characterized him, the large eyes taking in the world and processing it internally. But he didn't sit near the windows anymore. He chose a desk in the middle of the room, away from the glass, away from the view of the tree line that was visible from the school's east-facing windows. And when the other children ran to the windows during recess to watch a hawk or a deer or whatever piece of the natural world had caught their attention, Caleb stayed at his desk and didn't look. He knew what was in the woods. He'd seen it from his bedroom window, on all fours, watching his house with the patient attention of something that had been watching houses for a long time, and that would continue watching them long after the people inside had stopped looking back. And I think he understood, at 7 years old, with the clarity of a child who has seen something that adults choose not to see, that the windows worked both ways. That if you could see the tree line from the classroom, the tree line could see you. And some things, once they know where you are, don't stop watching just because you've stopped looking. I've been a backcountry ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park for 16 years, which means I've spent the better part of my adult life in the interior of the most biodiverse wilderness in the eastern United States, walking trails that most visitors don't know exist, checking on backcountry campsites that see maybe a dozen visitors a year, and maintaining the infrastructure of a park that covers over 800 square miles of some of the most rugged terrain in the Appalachian chain. The Smokies are not what most people think they are. The visitor experience, the views from Clingman's Dome, and the walk to Laurel Falls and the Elk in Cataloochee gives people the impression that they know the park, that they've experienced it, that the mountains they've seen from the overlooks are the same mountains that exist in the interior. They're not. The backcountry of the Smokies is a different world, a place where the trails thin to faint paths and the forest closes in, and the terrain gets steep enough and dense enough that you can walk for hours without seeing the sky. I know this world the way a sailor knows the ocean, by experience and by instinct, by the accumulated wisdom of 16 years of being alone in it, and learning its patterns and its moods and the things it does when nobody's watching. There are places in the park where I don't go anymore. I need to be clear that these aren't officially restricted areas. The Park Service hasn't closed them. There are no signs, no barriers, no administrative designations that would prevent a hiker or a ranger from entering them. They're just places where my experience, which is the only tool I have that the Park Service didn't issue me, tells me that something is different. That the normal relationship between a person and the forest, the basic agreement that says you walk through and the forest lets you and both parties go about their business without incident, doesn't fully apply. The forest in these places is paying attention in a way that forests don't normally pay attention, and whatever it's paying attention with is not something I want to meet. The drainage I'm talking about is on the North Carolina side of the park, in a section that I'm not going to identify more specifically than that, because I don't want anyone going there to test what I'm telling them. It's a steep hollow that drops off a ridge through some of the densest vegetation in the park, the particular combination of rhododendron and mountain laurel that grows in the Smokies at middle elevations, where the moisture is high and the canopy is thick, and the undergrowth has been growing undisturbed since before the park was established. Rhododendron and laurel are not like other understory plants. They don't grow in patches that you can walk around or in stands that you can push through. They grow in thickets, interlocking masses of woody stems and waxy leaves that can extend for hundreds of yards in every direction, so dense that you can't see 10 feet into them, and so thick that attempting to push through them without tools is essentially impossible. The old mountain people called them laurel hells, and the name is accurate. Getting lost in a laurel thicket is one of the most disorienting experiences the Appalachian forest can produce, because the vegetation blocks sight lines in every direction, and the stems grow in curves and loops that redirect your movement until you're walking in circles without realizing it. The drainage where it happened is choked with this vegetation. The trail, which was maintained decades ago and has since been downgraded to a manway that the Park Service doesn't actively maintain, runs through the laurel in a narrow corridor, a tunnel of green that's barely wide enough for a person to walk through without the branches brushing both shoulders. The canopy overhead is dense enough that the trail exists in a permanent twilight even at midday, the light filtering through so many layers of leaves that it arrives at the trail surface as a dim green glow that is atmospheric and beautiful, and, after a certain distance, deeply claustrophobic. I was in this drainage in November of 2019, doing a trail condition assessment, which is a fancy way of saying I was walking the trail and noting where it needed clearing and where erosion was undermining the tread and where blowdowns were blocking passage. It was a routine assignment, the kind of thing I'd done hundreds of times on hundreds of trails, and I was moving at my usual pace, steady and unhurried, the clipboard in one hand and a radio on my belt, and the comfortable solitude that 16 years of backcountry work had made my natural state. I became aware of being watched about 40 minutes into the drainage. I need to describe what I mean by this because the sensation was specific and distinct from the normal awareness of wildlife that anyone who works in the backcountry develops. When a bear is nearby, you feel it as a weight, a directional pressure, a sense of mass and attention coming from a specific point in the forest, the biological proximity alarm that mammals have been carrying since before we were human. Bears feel like bears. Large, solid, present. You can usually pinpoint the direction and estimate the distance, and the feeling resolves when the bear moves away. This was not that. This was the sensation of being watched from multiple positions simultaneously, from inside the laurel thicket on both sides of the trail, from points that were close, within maybe 20 or 30 feet, and that were distributed along the trail ahead of me and behind me at the same time. Not a single observer, but multiple, stationed in the vegetation on both flanks, tracking my progress through the drainage with an attention that was coordinated and deliberate. I stopped walking and listened. The drainage was quiet. November in the Smokies is a quiet time. The songbirds mostly gone, the insects dormant, the forest stripped to its fundamental sounds of wind and water, and the creaking of bare branches. But beneath those sounds, in the laurel on both sides of the trail, I heard movement. Not the crashing of an animal pushing through brush, not the snapping of branches or the rustling of leaves. Something subtler, more controlled, the sound of laurel branches being carefully displaced and released, the woody stems flexing under pressure and springing back into position, the particular sound that the vegetation makes when something moves through it, that knows how to move through it without breaking it. The sounds were on both sides of me, moving when I moved, stopping when I stopped, keeping pace with my position on the trail with a precision that suggested not one large animal paralleling my route, but multiple entities maintaining stations in the thicket, leapfrogging along the trail as I advanced, some ahead and some behind, forming a corridor of observation through which I was walking. I tried to see into the laurel. At the edge of the trail, where the vegetation started, I could see maybe 5 feet into the thicket before the density of the stems and leaves blocked everything. The interior of the laurel was dark, the light barely penetrating, and the shapes I could make out were the twisting stems and the arching branches and the shadows they cast on each other. Nothing that I could identify as a figure. Nothing that my eyes could lock onto and resolve into a form. But the sounds continued, and the feeling of being watched intensified, and something in the laurel on both sides of the trail was aware of me and was moving with me and was close enough that I should have been able to see it and couldn't. I kept walking, not because I was brave, but because the trail was the only clear path through the drainage, and turning back would have meant walking toward whatever was behind me, and going forward at least maintained the fiction that I was making progress toward the far end of the drainage, where the trail climbed out of the laurel and onto the ridge. I walked with my hand near the radio, not touching it, not pressing the transmit button, because calling for help would have required me to explain what I needed help with, and what I needed help with was a feeling and a sound that no dispatch protocol addresses. The sounds kept pace. Every time I paused, the laurel on both sides would go still, the branches settling, the sound ceasing, and every time I resumed walking, within 2 or 3 steps, the movement would resume, the branches flexing and releasing in a pattern that tracked my position, that stayed with me, that followed the trail the way a current follows a channel. Whatever was in the laurel was not walking through it the way a person or an animal would walk through it. A person pushing through that vegetation would make enormous noise, breaking stems and crunching leaves, and fighting the resistance of interlocking branches. A bear would flatten it, a deer would crash through it. Nothing with a body moves through dense mountain laurel quietly, because the physics of the vegetation don't allow it. The stems are woody and springy, and they resist displacement, and they snap back into position with force, and they produce sound as a consequence of their physical properties. But what I was hearing was quiet. Not silent, but quiet. The sounds of branches being displaced with knowledge and with care, manipulated rather than forced, worked through rather than pushed through. Whatever was moving in that laurel understood the vegetation at a level that no visitor and no animal I knew of could match. Understood how the stems connected, and how they flexed, and how to move through them without fighting them, navigating the thicket the way a fish navigates water, as a native element rather than an obstacle. It took me about 30 minutes to clear the drainage. The trail climbed out of the laurel and onto the ridge, and the vegetation opened up, and the sight lines extended, and the feeling of being watched diminished gradually, not suddenly, as if whatever had been tracking me was falling back as the laurel thinned, retreating to the density that was its habitat, its territory, the domain where it existed with an advantage that the open forest didn't provide. I stood on the ridge and looked back down into the drainage and saw nothing except the top of the laurel canopy, a solid green mass filling the hollow from ridge to creek, impenetrable from above as it was from within. Nothing moved. Nothing was visible. The drainage held its silence and its secrets, and whatever lived in its laurel hells stayed in them. I filed a report. Trail condition assessment, standard form, noting the maintenance needs and the blowdowns and the erosion. I did not note the sounds. I did not note the feeling of being watched from multiple positions in the laurel thicket. I did not note that something lives in that drainage that moves through the densest vegetation in the park with a fluency that no known animal possesses, and that tracks human movement through its territory with coordinated, deliberate attention. I've been back to the edge of that drainage twice since, both times in daylight, both times on the ridge above, looking down. Both times I've heard the laurel moving. Not wind, not random. The directional, purposeful sound of things shifting position in the thicket below, responding to my presence on the ridge, tracking me from their green world the way a fish tracks a shadow on the surface of a pond. I don't go into the drainage anymore. I've told the trail crew that the manway isn't worth maintaining, that the vegetation has reclaimed it past the point of reasonable recovery, that we should let it go. They accepted this because it's true. The trail is almost gone. The laurel is closing over it. And I think that's the point. I think the laurel is closing over it because whatever lives in that thicket doesn't want a trail through its territory, doesn't want humans walking a corridor through the green dark where it lives and moves and watches. The trail is being absorbed because the thicket is being allowed to absorb it, the vegetation reclaiming the space because nothing is preventing it from doing so, because the thing that lives in the laurel and the laurel itself have reached an understanding that serves them both. The trail will be gone in a few more years. The drainage will be solid laurel from ridge to creek, impenetrable, unnavigable, a green void in the park's interior where no trail exists and no maintenance is performed, and no hiker walks, and no ranger goes. And inside it, in the dark beneath the canopy, things will move through the stems with the silent fluency of organisms perfectly adapted to their environment, watching the ridges above, tracking the sounds of humans who walk along the edges of their world without knowing what watches from below. I know, I've heard them move. And the laurel, when it flexes and flexes again, sounds like breathing if you listen the right way. The slow, green breathing of a thicket that is alive in more ways than botany accounts for, and that holds in its dense interior things that have been there longer than trails and longer than rangers, and that will be there long after both are gone. I work for the Department of Social Services in a county in the Appalachian Highlands that I'm not going to identify because identifying it would identify Carl, and whatever Carl's situation is or was, he deserves the privacy that he chose for himself when he moved to the end of a hollow road 30 years ago and stopped participating in the world that generates paperwork and case files and the well-intentioned intrusions of people like me. My job title is Adult Protective Services Specialist, which means I check on elderly and disabled adults who live alone in remote locations, making sure they're safe and functional and not in need of services that the county can provide. Most of my visits are routine. An elderly woman whose neighbor hasn't seen her in a week. A disabled man whose mail has been accumulating. The quiet emergencies of people who live at the margins of society and who sometimes slip past the edge without anyone noticing until the smell reaches the road or the power company sends a disconnect notice. I cover a territory that includes some of the most remote terrain in the state, hollows where the roads end at the county line and the houses beyond are accessed by paths that aren't on any map. The work requires a tolerance for isolation and a comfort with entering situations where you don't know what you're going to find. I've found people who'd been dead for weeks. I've found people who were alive but had stopped eating or bathing or taking their medications, and who existed in conditions that would be unacceptable in any context except the one that rural Appalachia provides, which is the context of fierce independence and the right to live and die on your own terms, in your own house, without the government telling you how to do it. The call about Carl came in January of 2023. A neighbor, a man who lived about 2 miles down the hollow, had reported that he hadn't seen smoke from Carl's chimney in a week. In January, in these mountains, no smoke means no heat, and no heat means either the person has left or the person can't maintain their fire, and either scenario warranted a check. The neighbor described Carl as a man in his 70s who'd been living in a cabin at the end of the hollow for at least 30 years, a recluse who came to town twice a year for bulk supplies, who had no phone, no electricity, No running water, no connection to the modern world except the gravel road that connected his hollow to the county blacktop. The neighbor said Carl was functional but private, the kind of man who'd wave from a distance but wouldn't stop to talk, who kept to himself with a totality that went beyond introversion into something more deliberate, a chosen separation from human society that the neighbor respected without understanding. The road to Carl's place was rough. The county maintained it for the first 3 miles, after which it became a gravel track that deteriorated steadily until it ended at a turnaround about a mile from Carl's cabin. The last mile was a footpath that followed the creek through forest so dense that the January sky was barely visible through the bare branches. I parked at the turnaround and hiked in, carrying the standard welfare check supplies, a first aid kit, a bag of non-perishable food, an emergency blanket, and the clipboard with the forms that the department requires me to fill out regardless of what I find. The cabin was small, a single-story log structure with a stone chimney and a tin roof, sitting in a clearing at the head of the hollow where the terrain narrowed to a point and the ridges on both sides came close enough that the cabin felt less like a building in a clearing and more like a building in a crevice. The mountains pressing in from above and the forest pressing in from the sides and the hollow itself funneling everything, light and wind and sound, into the small space where Carl had chosen to live. The chimney was cold, no smoke, no heat shimmer, nothing rising from the stone stack. I approached the cabin, calling Carl's name, identifying myself, doing the verbal announcement that protocol requires and that most isolated residents expect, the verbal equivalent of knocking before entering someone's space. The front door opened before I reached the porch. Carl was standing in the doorway, a thin man, mid-70s, with the weathered skin and the lean build of someone who lives outdoors more than in, wearing heavy work clothes that were worn but clean, his hair long and gray and pulled back, his eyes sharp and alert with the particular brightness of someone who is fully competent and does not appreciate being checked on. He knew why I was there. He said he was fine. He said the chimney was cold because he'd been using a kerosene heater instead of the wood stove, that the stovepipe needed repair and he hadn't gotten to it. He showed me the heater, a standard kerosene unit sitting in the main room, producing adequate heat. I did the assessment, checked his mobility, his cognition, his nutrition, the condition of the cabin. Everything was acceptable. Carl was lucid, articulate, physically capable, and clearly capable of self-care. His pantry was stocked with the kind of supplies that someone who plans ahead and buys in bulk keeps: canned goods, dried beans, rice, flour, coffee, the staples of a mountain diet that could sustain a person through a winter without resupply. He had water from a spring. He had firewood stacked under a lean-to beside the cabin. He had kerosene for the heater and lamp oil for the lanterns. By every metric that my assessment form measured, Carl was a competent adult living independently in conditions of his choosing, and my job was to confirm that and leave. But the cabin showed signs of more than one person. I noticed it during the walkthrough. The main room, which served as kitchen and living space, had a table with 2 place settings, not one. 2 plates, 2 cups, 2 sets of utensils, arranged at 2 chairs on opposite sides of the table, the kind of arrangement that means 2 people are eating meals together regularly. I noted it without commenting, because a second place setting could mean anything: a habit maintained from a previous living arrangement, a superstition, an eccentricity. The back room was harder to explain. The cabin had 2 rooms, the main living space, and a back room separated by a blanket hung from a cord. Behind the blanket was Carl's sleeping area, a bed against one wall, neatly made, and on the floor against the opposite wall, a pallet. Blankets on the floor, arranged into a sleeping surface, the fabric compressed and shaped by regular use, the top blanket pulled back the way a cover is pulled back when someone gets up and doesn't make their bed. The pallet was being used, currently, regularly, by someone who slept on the floor of Carl's back room. There was clothing, not Carl's, hanging from a nail on the wall near the pallet, a jacket that was too small for Carl, heavily worn, stained with dirt and what might have been sap or blood, the fabric torn in places and mended crudely, with stitches that were functional but not skilled. Beneath it, on the floor, a pair of shoes that were barely shoes anymore, the soles worn through, the uppers cracked and separated from the stitching, the kind of deterioration that happens to footwear that is worn constantly, outdoors, over rough terrain, for months or years without replacement. I came back to the main room and looked at the second place setting again and looked at Carl, who was standing by the kerosene heater, watching me with an expression that had shifted from irritation to something more guarded, more careful. The expression of a man who is calculating how much the person in front of him has noticed and what they're going to do with what they've noticed. I asked who else lived here. He said nobody. I pointed at the second plate on the table. He looked at it for a long time, long enough that the silence between us became its own kind of communication. And then he looked at me with eyes that held something I can only describe as a plea, wrapped in a warning, the look of a man who needs you to understand something that he cannot say directly. And he said they come and go. I asked who comes and goes. He shook his head, not refusing to answer but indicating that the question was wrong, that who wasn't the right word, that whatever came and went through his cabin wasn't something that who applied to in the way I was using it. I asked if he was in danger. He almost smiled. No, he said. They don't hurt me. They come in from the cold. I feed them. They sleep. They leave before light. He said this matter-of-factly, the way you describe feeding stray cats, a routine of charity that had become part of his daily life, accommodated and unremarkable. I asked how many. He was quiet again, and then he said it varies. Sometimes 1, sometimes 4 or 5, more in winter. He said winter is hard for them, the cold, the snow. He said they know his cabin is warm and that he'll feed them, and that he won't try to keep them, and that they can leave when they want. I asked what they were. He looked at me with that same expression, the plea and the warning combined, and he said they're people. And then he paused and added, or they were. He wouldn't say more. He redirected the conversation to practical matters, confirming that he had sufficient supplies and that his health was adequate and that he didn't need services from the county. He walked me to the door and stood on the porch as I left, and the last thing he said to me was a request. He asked me not to send anyone else. He said they wouldn't come if they smelled other people. He said it had taken years to build the trust. He said if I sent the sheriff or another social worker or anyone else, they'd stop coming and they'd be in the cold all winter, and some of them wouldn't survive. I filed my report. Carl was competent. Carl was safe. Carl declined services. Case closed. I did not mention the second place setting or the pallet or the clothing or the conversation about things that come and go in the night and that sleep on a hermit's floor and eat from a hermit's table and leave before dawn. I went back in March, on my own time, not in an official capacity. I parked at the turnaround and hiked the mile to the cabin. Carl was splitting wood in the clearing. He saw me and set the axe down and looked at me the way you look at someone who has come back when you ask them not to. I told him I wasn't there officially. I told him I wanted to understand. He studied me for a long time, and then he nodded and invited me inside and poured coffee, and we sat at the table, both place settings in front of us, and he told me what he knew. He said they'd been coming for about 15 years. He said the first one came in a winter so cold the creek froze solid, a figure at the edge of the clearing in the early hours, low to the ground, watching the cabin the way an animal watches a potential food source, wary and desperate and ready to run. He'd left food on the porch. The food was gone in the morning. He left food every night for a week. On the 7th night, he left the door open and went to bed, and in the morning the food was gone, and the pallet he'd laid out by the stove was warm and compressed, and there were footprints on the floor that were bare and human-shaped, but that showed the wide toe splay and the flat contact of feet that had never worn shoes. He said they were small, smaller than average adults, thin, with hair that was long and matted, and skin that was dark with dirt and exposure. He said they wore clothing sometimes, scraps and pieces that they'd found or taken, never a complete outfit, just fragments draped or tied around their bodies. He said they didn't speak, not to him, not to each other, not in his presence. They communicated with sounds, guttural clicks and hums that served as language without being language, a system of communication that was functional and complex, and that he'd learned to interpret over the years, understanding the basic vocabulary of alarm and hunger and greeting and departure without understanding the grammar. He said they were people. He said this again, firmly, the way you state something that you've thought about for a long time and are certain of. People who had been living in the mountains, in the woods and the caves and the abandoned mines for long enough that the woods had become their world, and the world beyond the woods had become foreign and hostile. He said he didn't know where they'd come from or how long they'd been in the mountains. He said some of them were children, born into whatever community existed in the forest, children who had never seen a house or a road or a town, who experienced Carl's cabin as the most complex structure in their world. I asked him why he didn't report them. He looked at me with an expression that was patient and sad. He said, "Report them to whom?" He said the county would send people with clipboards, and the state would send people with tranquilizer guns, and the federal government would send people with cameras, and that whatever happened after that would not be good for the people who slept on his floor and ate from his table and who trusted him because he had spent 15 years earning that trust by doing nothing except leaving food on the porch and the door open. He said they were surviving, barely, some winters, but surviving. And his cabin was part of how they survived. A warm place on the coldest nights, a source of food when the forest couldn't provide, a rest stop on whatever circuit they traveled through the mountains. He left. I drove home and sat in my kitchen and thought about what Carl had told me, and about the pallet on the floor, and the second plate on the table, and the worn-out shoes, and the jacket mended with crude stitches, and the footprints with the wide toe splay of feet that had never worn shoes. I didn't report it. I didn't send anyone. I closed Carl's case, and I left him alone with his kerosene heater, and his two-place settings, and his open door, and the things that came in from the cold on winter nights, and slept on his floor, and ate his food, and left before the light. They come and go, Carl said, and I think about that. I think about what comes and goes through a cabin at the end of a hollow in the Appalachian Mountains, what sleeps on the floor and eats from the table, and leaves before dawn and lives in the woods, and communicates without language, and survives winter after winter in the oldest mountains on the continent. And I think about Carl, alone in that cabin, 70-something years old, feeding them, sheltering them, keeping their secret with the devoted discretion of a man who has made himself responsible for something that the world would destroy if it knew about it. They come and go, and Carl leaves the door open, and the mountains keep what they keep, and the hollows hold what they hold. And somewhere in the forest above Carl's cabin, in the cold, in the dark, things that were once people and that are still something wait for winter and for warmth and for the one person in the world who will feed them without trying to catch them. I've been caving in the karst systems of the Appalachian Plateau for 15 years, exploring the limestone cave networks that underlie large sections of West Virginia and that produce some of the most extensive underground systems in the eastern United States. The geology is favorable for cave formation, the thick layers of Mississippian-age limestone dissolving along fractures and bedding plains to create passages that range from crawlways barely large enough for a human body to chambers the size of auditoriums. The Greenbrier Valley in particular is honeycombed with caves, hundreds of known systems, and an unknown number of undiscovered ones. The limestone plateau riddled with passages that connect and branch and extend for miles beneath the surface, a subterranean network that mirrors the surface drainage in its complexity, and that has been forming for millions of years. I cave because I'm drawn to the unknown in a way that the surface world doesn't satisfy. Every time you push into an unexplored passage, you're walking in a space that no human has ever seen, that has existed in darkness since the rock formed, and that will continue existing in darkness after you leave. The caves don't care about you. They're not hostile and they're not welcoming. They simply are, massive and indifferent, and the experience of being inside them, of moving through the Earth's interior by headlamp and feel, is as close to genuine exploration as the modern world allows. Our group was 4 people. Myself, a man named Travis who I'd been caving with for over a decade, and 2 others, Sarah and Doug, experienced cavers who'd been part of our survey team for several years. We were working in a cave system in Greenbrier County that had been partially explored in the 1980s, but that contained multiple passages that had never been pushed to their ends, side tunnels and crawlways that the original survey team had noted but not entered. The kind of leads that represent the frontier of cave exploration, passages that might go nowhere or might open into chambers and systems that double the known extent of the cave. We'd been in the cave since early morning on a Saturday in March of 2022. The entrance was a hillside opening about 4 feet high and 6 feet wide, gated with a steel bar structure that the conservation group maintained to protect the cave's bat population. We had the key and the permits and the equipment, helmets and headlamps and vertical gear, and the survey instruments that we used to map new passage. The plan was to push a crawlway that had been noted by the 1980s survey team as continuing but unexplored. A low passage branching off a main corridor about 2,000 feet from the entrance. The crawlway was tight, maybe 18 inches high and 2 feet wide. The kind of passage that you negotiate on your belly, pushing your gear bag ahead of you, the rock ceiling inches from your helmet and the floor pressing against your chest. I went first, Travis behind me, Sarah and Doug following. The passage continued for maybe 200 feet, the floor sandy, the walls smooth limestone showing the dissolution patterns of water that had carved this space over tens of thousands of years. The air was moving, which was a good sign, indicating that the passage connected to a larger space with its own ventilation, not a dead end but a route to something bigger. The crawlway opened, gradually at first, the ceiling rising, the walls widening, the passage transitioning from belly crawl to hands and knees to a low crouch, and then abruptly into standing height. I stood up and swept my headlamp around the space and realized we'd found a chamber. It was large, maybe 30 feet across and 15 feet high, roughly circular, with a sand floor and smooth limestone walls that curved upward to a ceiling, showing the characteristic dome shape of a chamber formed by water dissolution at a water table intersection. The sand floor was deep, maybe a foot, the fine-grained sediment deposited by water that had flowed through the chamber at some point in the geological past and that had since drained away, leaving the sand as a record of its presence. Several passage openings were visible in the walls, dark holes leading in different directions, the chamber serving as a junction in the cave system, a hub from which multiple routes branched into the surrounding limestone. Travis stood up beside me, and then Sarah and Doug emerged from the crawlway, and we stood in a group at the edge of the chamber and swept our lights across the space, and nobody spoke for maybe 30 seconds, because what we were seeing required time to process. The nests were arranged around the perimeter of the chamber, 7 of them, spaced roughly evenly along the curved wall. Each one was a circular depression in the sand floor, about 3 feet in diameter and maybe 4 inches deep, scooped out of the sand and lined with material. The lining was what stopped us. It wasn't natural cave debris. It was collected material, brought from outside, leaves and moss and animal fur and strips of fabric. The leaves were dry and brown, the moss desiccated, the fur matted and compressed from being lain on. The fabric was the most disturbing element. Strips of cloth, torn rather than cut, showing patterns and colors that identified them as pieces of clothing. A strip of plaid flannel, a piece of denim, a section of what looked like a nylon jacket, the synthetic fabric shiny against the organic materials it was nested with. Someone had torn clothing into strips and used the strips to line a sleeping depression in the sand floor of a cave chamber 2,000 feet from the nearest entrance. Each nest showed the compression and contouring of regular use. The sand was packed smooth beneath the lining material, shaped by the weight and the form of a body that slept there repeatedly, the depression showing the curve of a torso and the position of limbs in the way that a well-used mattress shows the sleeping shape of its occupant. Some of the nests were larger than others. The biggest was probably 4 feet across, the smallest, maybe 2.5, adult and child-sized. A group that included different ages, sleeping in the same chamber, in nests arranged around the perimeter, the way a family arranges beds in a room, each member with their own space but all within proximity of the others. The chamber smelled, not the mineral, damp smell of a normal cave. This was organic, musky, warm in a way that cave air is never warm. The smell of bodies, multiple bodies, the accumulated scent of living organisms that occupied this space regularly and that left their biological residue in the sand and the nesting materials and the air itself. It was animal-like, but not quite animal. The undertone was human, body odor, the particular complex of fatty acids and bacteria that human skin produces, the smell that any locker room or crowded room generates, the biological signature of our species, but overlaid with something else, something wilder, more concentrated, the smell of humans who lived without soap or running water, or the hygiene that separates the civilized from the feral. The sand around the nests showed footprints. Travis knelt and examined them with his headlamp. Barefoot, human-shaped, 5 toes, an arch, a heel, but the toes were splayed wide, much wider than the toes of someone who wears shoes. the spaces between them suggesting feet that had never been constrained by footwear, that had developed their natural spread unimpeded by soles and uppers and the compressive geometry of shoes. The foot contact was flat, the entire sole pressing into the sand simultaneously, no heel-to-toe rolling, the gait of someone who walks on the balls and the flats of their feet like an animal, distributing weight evenly, moving quietly. The prints were multiple sizes, large, medium, and small, adults and children. The passage leading deeper into the cave, the one directly opposite the crawlway we'd entered through, showed the most traffic. The sand floor in front of the opening was smooth, polished by the repeated passage of bodies moving through, the footprints overlapping and blurring into a continuous surface of compressed sand that said this route was used constantly, daily, the main thoroughfare of whatever community slept in these nests, and that traveled deeper into the cave system for purposes we could only guess at. Doug said we should follow it. Travis said nothing. Sarah was already moving back toward the crawlway, her body making the decision that her mind was still processing. I stood in the chamber and looked at the nests and the footprints and the worn passage leading deeper, and I felt something that I had never felt in 15 years of caving, a feeling that went beyond the normal calculation of risk and reward that governs every decision underground. I felt like I was trespassing, not in the legal sense, but in the biological sense, the way you'd feel if you walked into a bear's den with cubs, the awareness that you are in something's home, and that the something is not here right now, but will be coming back, and that when it comes back, it will find your scent and your tracks and the evidence of your intrusion in its most private space. We left, all four of us, back through the crawlway, back through the main passage, back to the entrance and the daylight and the hillside and the truck. We didn't discuss it during the crawl-out. Caving requires focus, and the tight passage demanded concentration that left no bandwidth for processing what we'd found. It was in the truck, driving back down the mountain, that the conversation started. Travis said we should report it to the Cave Conservancy. Doug said we should report it to the police. Sarah said we shouldn't report it to anyone. She said this with a certainty that surprised me, a firmness that came from something she'd worked out during the crawl, some conclusion she'd reached in the dark that she was now stating without qualification. She said whatever was living in that chamber was living there because no one knew about it, and that reporting it would end the living. She said the authorities would come with their lights and their equipment and their institutional need to categorize and contain, and that whatever was found in that cave would be removed from it and placed into a system that had no category for what they were and no protocol for what to do with them. We didn't report it. We discussed it twice more over the following weeks, and each time the conversation ended at the same place, the agreement that what we'd found was something that existed outside the frameworks that reporting would invoke, something that the world above ground didn't have a place for and wouldn't handle well. I've thought about them every day since, the nests, the footprints, the cloth strips torn from clothing that was made in factories and sold in stores and worn by people who lived above ground, and that had somehow made its way into a cave chamber 2,000 feet from daylight, lining the sleeping depression of someone who had never bought clothing and who acquired it the way animals acquire what they need, by taking it from the world above during whatever excursions brought them to the surface. I think about the children, the small nests, the small footprints, the small bodies that slept in circular depressions lined with moss and fur and pieces of other people's clothing, children born underground, presumably, children who had never seen the sun, whose entire world was stone and darkness, and the social structure of a group that had adapted to an environment where humans were never meant to live, and that had been living there long enough to raise the next generation in it. I think about what's deeper. The passage that led further into the cave, the worn sand floor that said the chamber was a waypoint, not a destination, that whatever lived in those nests traveled deeper into the mountain for purposes that we will never know because we didn't follow and will never follow. And I think about the cave system itself. Miles of passage beneath the Greenbrier Valley, mapped and unmapped, known and unknown, extending through the limestone in every direction, connecting chambers and corridors and sumps and vaults in a network that is dark and constant temperature and protected from the weather and from the world above, and that provides, for something that has adapted to it, an environment that is as stable and as secure as any habitat on the surface. They're down there, in the nests, in the chamber, in the passages that go deeper, sleeping in their circular depressions, walking the limestone corridors on flat, splayed feet, raising children in the dark, coming to the surface when they need what the surface provides, and returning underground when they have it, living in the space between the human world and the geological world, in the caves that the mountains made and that have been waiting for a very long time for someone to move in. I'll never go back to that chamber, but the chamber is still there, and the nests are still there, and the footprints in the sand are being covered by new footprints every night. The traffic of a community that lives beneath the feet of everyone who walks above them on the surface, separated by a few hundred feet of rock, and the absolute darkness that makes the separation permanent. They're down there, and they're fine, and they don't need us to know about them. But I know, and I lie in bed at night and think about the limestone beneath my house, and the cave systems that riddle the Greenbrier Valley, and the darkness that fills them, and the things that fill the darkness, sleeping in their nests, wrapped in moss and fur and the torn strips of our clothing, breathing the cave air with the steady rhythm of organisms that have found their place in the world, and that are not lost, and are not hiding, and are not waiting to be found. They're home, and the cave keeps them the way all homes keep the people who live in them, quietly, darkly, with the long patience of stone that was here before them, and will be here after them, and that holds whatever it holds without judgment or complaint. My wife Anna and I bought the cabin property in 2016, 20 acres of mountain land in Unicoi County, Tennessee, about 8 miles from the nearest town and surrounded on 3 sides by the Cherokee National Forest. The land sits on a bench partway up a ridge, a natural shelf in the terrain where the slope levels out enough to build on before resuming its climb to the ridgetop maybe 300 yards above. The cabin is simple, a 2-bedroom structure that we built ourselves over the course of a summer, log-sided with a metal roof and a covered porch that faces west toward the main ridge and the sunset. We use it for weekend retreats, driving up from Johnson City on Friday evenings and leaving Sunday afternoons, a rhythm that has become the anchor of our marriage and the thing that keeps us sane during the work weeks that would otherwise blur into a continuous stream of obligation and noise. The property is isolated in the way that only mountain land in eastern Tennessee can be isolated, surrounded by national forest that extends for miles in every direction. The nearest neighbor, a retired couple about 2 miles down the mountain, the nearest paved road 4 miles of gravel away. The isolation was the point. We wanted a place where the only sounds were natural sounds, where the evenings were quiet enough to hear the creek at the bottom of the hollow and the owls on the ridge and the particular silence that mountains produce when the wind dies and the forest holds still, and the only thing moving is the darkness itself, settling into the valleys like water. I've lived in these mountains my entire life. I was born in Irwin, grew up hunting and fishing in the Cherokee National Forest, spent my summers in the backcountry when other kids were at summer camps or in swimming pools. I know the sounds of these mountains the way a musician knows the sounds of their instrument, not just the individual notes but the combinations, the harmonics, the way different species produce sounds that interact and overlap and create the acoustic texture of a healthy forest. I know what foxes sound like when they scream in breeding season, a sound that has sent more than one uninformed visitor running for their car. I know what bobcats sound like when they're marking territory, a ragged yowl that carries for miles. I know barred owls and their full repertoire, the who cooks for you and the caterwauling and the juvenile begging calls that sound like nothing else in the woods. I know coyotes, which arrived in these mountains in the 1990s, and which produce a chorus that sounds like 20 animals, but is usually 3 or 4. I know every sound the eastern forest produces, and I know the sounds it doesn't produce, the sounds that don't belong, the sounds that arrive without precedent, and that you can't file in any category your experience has prepared. September of 2022, we arrived at the cabin on a Friday night later than usual, around 10 o'clock, the drive having been delayed by a late meeting that Anna couldn't reschedule. The mountain road was dark, the gravel track winding through forest that was still holding its full summer canopy, the headlights carving a tunnel of light through vegetation that pressed close on both sides. We pulled into the clearing where the cabin sat and killed the engine and got out, and the September night wrapped around us the way mountain nights do, cool and dark and scented with the particular mix of pine and decaying leaves and creek water that September produces in these elevations. We were unloading the car, carrying bags from the trunk to the porch, when I heard the sounds. They came from the ridge above the cabin, from the steep, forested slope that climbed from our bench to the ridgetop, maybe 200 yards above us, and slightly to the northeast. Multiple sources, not one voice but several, positioned at different points along the ridge, spaced maybe 30 or 40 yards apart, producing sounds that were high-pitched and rapid, and that carried down the slope with the clarity that mountain air provides at night when the temperature is dropping and the air is dense and stable, and sound travels without distortion. I stopped on the porch with a bag in each hand and listened. Anna was behind me at the car, and she stopped too, because the sounds were impossible not to notice, loud enough and strange enough that they arrested whatever you were doing and demanded your full auditory attention. They were vocalizations, produced by something with a vocal apparatus capable of complex sound production, something that had the physical equipment, throat, mouth, tongue, lips, to generate sounds that included consonant-like clicks and stops and vowel-like sustained tones that rose and fell in pitch. The sounds were rapid, delivered in bursts that lasted maybe 2 or 3 seconds, followed by pauses of similar length. The rhythm of communication, the pattern of entities exchanging information, one producing a burst and pausing, while another responded from a different position on the ridge. They were not animal calls. I need to be clear about this because the immediate rational response to hearing strange sounds in the forest is to search for a known animal that could produce them, and I searched and found nothing. No animal in the eastern forest produces sounds with this complexity. Foxes scream, but their vocalizations are simple, 1 or 2 notes sustained or repeated. Bobcats yowl in patterns that are recognizable and limited. Owls vocalize with a range that's broader than most people realize, but that doesn't include the rapid, consonant-heavy, multi-tonal sounds I was hearing. Coyotes produce complex chorus vocalizations, but the individual sounds are howls and yips that are nothing like what was coming off that ridge. These sounds were produced by something with a human-like vocal apparatus. The range, the complexity, the ability to produce rapid sequences of differentiated sounds that included both plosive consonants and sustained vowels. All of this pointed to a vocal tract that was capable of human speech. But what I was hearing was not speech. There were no words, no repeated patterns that suggested vocabulary, no grammatical structure that suggested syntax, just streams of complex sound, varied and rapid, exchanged between multiple sources in a pattern that said communication without saying language. Anna came to stand beside me on the porch. We listened together. The sounds continued, the exchanges moving along the ridge from east to west, the positions of the sources shifting as if the entities producing them were moving through the forest on the ridge top, while communicating, traveling and talking at the same time, the sounds tracking their progress along the ridge, the way voices track the progress of people walking and talking on a street. The movement was significant. Whatever was making these sounds was not stationary. It was moving along the ridge at a pace that suggested walking, not running, the sources maintaining their spacing as they traveled, the formation holding its shape the way a group of people maintains formation when they're walking together with purpose, not wandering but going somewhere, following the ridgeline toward a destination. The sounds continued for about 20 minutes. They moved from east to west along the ridge, growing slightly louder as they passed the section closest to our cabin, and then diminishing as they moved further west, the vocalizations fading with distance until the last traces of sound were absorbed by the mountain and the night was quiet again. Not gradually silent, but abruptly quiet, the way sound ends when its source moves behind a terrain feature, the ridge curving enough to block the direct path between the sources and our ears. We stood on the porch for another 10 minutes, listening. Nothing. The forest returned to its normal nighttime sounds, the creek and the insects and the distant owl, the acoustic bass line that I'd been hearing my entire life, and that felt like silence only because of what had preceded it. We unloaded the car and went inside, and Anna asked me what that was, and I said I didn't know, and she accepted this because she's lived with me long enough to know that when I say I don't know about a sound in these mountains, it means the sound is genuinely unknown to me, not just unfamiliar but uncategorizable, outside the framework of 35 years of mountain experience. We heard them again on Saturday night. Same time, shortly after 10. Same ridge, same direction of travel, east to west. Same vocalizations, the rapid, complex, multi-source sounds that had the rhythm of communication without the structure of language. Same duration, roughly 20 minutes. Same pattern of movement, the sources tracking along the ridgeline, maintaining formation, passing above our cabin, and continuing west until the terrain blocked the sound. And again on Sunday morning, early, maybe 5 a.m., the sounds waking us in the pre-dawn dark, coming from the ridge again, but this time moving west to east. The return trip, the group traveling back along the route they'd followed the previous night, heading east with the same pace and the same formation and the same vocalizations that filled the dark forest above our cabin, with the sound of something communicating in a way that I couldn't understand and couldn't ignore, couldn't explain. We've been back to the cabin many times since that weekend. We've heard the sounds on approximately half of our visits, always after dark, always from the ridge, always moving, always multiple sources, always the same complex vocalizations that occupy the space between animal calls and human speech without being either. I've tried to record them. My phone has captured fragments, short recordings that are degraded by distance and the limitations of a phone microphone, and that sound, when played back, like wind or distant coyotes or nothing at all, the complexity and the character of the sounds lost in the translation from live acoustic experience to digital reproduction. The recordings are useless. The sounds exist only in the moment of hearing them, in the dark, on the ridge, where they're unmistakable and undeniable, and unlike anything else in these mountains. I've talked to people, carefully, the way you talk about things in small mountain towns when you're not sure how the conversation will be received. Most people have nothing to offer. A few, the older ones, the ones who've lived in these mountains their whole lives, give me a look that I've come to recognize as the look of someone who knows what I'm describing and who has decided that knowing is sufficient and that talking about it is not necessary or wise. One man, a retired forester in his 80s who'd worked in the Cherokee National Forest for 40 years, told me that the sounds have been reported for as long as people have lived in these mountains. He said the Cherokee had a name for them, or for whatever made them, and that the name translated roughly to the ones who talk without words. He said they'd always been on the ridges. He said they traveled at night, following the ridgelines the way humans follow roads, using the high ground as a highway system that connected the drainages and the hollows and the remote interior of the mountains. He said they'd been there before the Cherokee and would be there after everyone else left. I asked him what they were. He said he didn't know. He said nobody knew. He said the mountains were old enough and big enough and dense enough to hold things that the surface world had never cataloged, and that the surface world's inability to catalog them was not the same as their non-existence. Something lives on the ridges above our cabin, something that moves at night in groups, following the high ground, communicating in rapid, complex vocalizations that require a human-like vocal apparatus, but that don't constitute human language. Something that has been there long enough for the Cherokee to have named it, and for the old-timers to have accepted it, and for the mountains to have incorporated it into the normal functioning of a forest that holds more than what the daylight reveals. I don't know what they are. I don't know if they're human or something adjacent to human or something that was human once and isn't anymore. I know what they sound like. I know where they travel. I know they move in groups and that they communicate and that they pass above my cabin on a route they've been following for longer than cabins have existed in these mountains. And I know that the sounds they make aren't language, not anymore. Whatever they once spoke, whatever words their ancestors used to communicate the things that language communicates, needs and plans and fears and the names of the people they loved, those words are gone. What remains is the impulse to communicate without the structure to do it, the vocal capability without the cognitive architecture, the sound without the meaning. Or maybe the meaning is there, and I just can't hear it. Maybe the sounds carry information that my ears can detect but my brain can't decode, a language that diverged from mine so long ago that the common root is invisible, the shared ancestor buried under thousands of years of separate evolution in separate environments, one in the light and one in the dark. They talk, on the ridge, in the dark, moving through the forest that is theirs in ways it will never be mine. They talk to each other in a language I can't understand. And every time I hear them, I stand on the porch and I listen, and I try to hear words in the sounds and I can't. And the sounds move along the ridge and fade into the west, and the mountain is quiet again, and I go inside and I close the door, and I live my life in a cabin on a bench, on a mountain where something walks above me at night and speaks in a voice that is almost human and that says things I will never understand. I own about 300 acres in the mountains of Buchanan County, Virginia, a piece of land that's been in my family since my grandfather bought it in the 1950s for the timber rights, and that I've been managing for wildlife since I inherited it 15 years ago. The property sits between two ridges, the terrain forming a natural valley with a creek at the bottom and steep, forested slopes on both sides that climb to narrow ridge tops maybe 500 feet above the creek. Between the two ridges, at the south end of the property, there's a gap, a natural saddle where the ridges come close together and the terrain between them narrows to maybe 50 yards of relatively level ground before the slopes resume on the other side. It's the kind of topographic feature that concentrates wildlife movement, a funnel that every deer and bear and coyote in the area uses when traveling between the drainages on either side of the ridges. I've hunted this gap my entire life, and my father hunted it before me, and my grandfather hunted it before that. It's productive because it's strategic, and it's strategic because the terrain gives animals no choice but to pass through it if they want to cross from one drainage to the next. I maintain 12 trail cameras across the property. I've been running cameras for about 8 years, using them to monitor wildlife populations and movement patterns and to inform my hunting strategy. The cameras are standard infrared units, the kind that outdoor stores sell by the thousands, motion-triggered, capable of capturing still photographs or short video clips day and night, using an infrared flash that's invisible to animals. I check the cards every 2 to 3 weeks during hunting season and monthly during the off-season, pulling the memory cards and loading them onto my laptop to review the images. Over 8 years, I've accumulated hundreds of thousands of photographs, the visual record of everything that moves through my property, deer and turkey and bear and coyote and bobcat, and the occasional fox and the very rare mountain lion that the State Wildlife Agency says doesn't exist in Virginia, but that my cameras have captured twice. The camera in the gap is my most productive unit. I've positioned it on a tree at the edge of the saddle, about 4 feet off the ground, aimed across the narrowest point of the gap, so that anything passing through is captured at a distance of maybe 20 feet, close enough for clear identification in the infrared images. The camera takes 3 photographs in rapid sequence when triggered, 1 per second, giving me a series that shows the animal entering, crossing, and exiting the detection zone. The images are time-stamped, and the camera records the temperature and the moon phase and the battery level, the metadata that turns a photograph into a data point. November of 2022, I pulled the card on a Saturday morning and loaded it onto my laptop in the cabin that sits at the north end of the property. The card contained the usual, maybe 400 images accumulated over 2 weeks, the normal traffic of a gap that sees heavy wildlife use in November, when the deer are in rut and moving at all hours. I scrolled through them the way I always do, the steady rhythm of deer after turkey after coyote, the timestamps marching through the days and nights. The sequence was captured at 2:23 a.m. on a Tuesday. The camera had triggered on motion and captured 3 photographs at 1-second intervals, the standard burst. I scrolled to the first image and stopped. The photograph showed figures, not deer, not bear, not any animal that I'd ever captured on this camera, or any camera in 8 years of monitoring. Figures, bipedal, upright, running through the gap at a speed that had blurred them in the image, the motion faster than the camera's shutter speed could freeze, the body smeared across the frame, the way a photograph smears anything that moves too fast for the exposure time. But they weren't so blurred that I couldn't see them. The infrared illumination had caught them at maybe 20 feet, close enough that even with the motion blur, details were visible. There were at least 4 figures, possibly 5. The blur made it difficult to count exactly because the trailing edges of one figure overlapped with the leading edges of the next, the group so close together that in the blurred image they almost merged. They were running in single file through the gap, following the game trail that every animal on the property uses, moving from south to north through the saddle between the ridges. They were human in basic shape: 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, a torso, the fundamental configuration of the human body recognizable even through the motion blur, upright, bipedal, running on 2 legs the way humans run, except that everything about the way they were running was wrong. The forward lean was the first thing. Sprinters lean forward, Every runner leans forward to some degree, the angle increasing with speed. But these figures were leaning at an angle that went beyond sprinting form into something that looked more like falling. Their torsos nearly horizontal, pitched forward so far that their centers of gravity should have been ahead of their feet, should have sent them face first into the ground. But they weren't falling. They were running, their legs driving them forward at a speed that the blur suggested was extraordinary, their bodies held in this impossible lean by a velocity that kept them balanced the way a bicycle is balanced by speed. Their arms were wrong. When humans sprint, the arms pump in opposition to the legs, right arm forward with left leg, the arms bent at the elbows, the hands moving from hip to shoulder in the biomechanical rhythm that maximizes speed and balance. These figures' arms were extended forward, stretched out in front of their bodies, like a person reaching for something while running. The arms long, longer than seemed right for the size of the torsos, extended ahead of the bodies as if reaching for the ground or for something in front of them. And they were naked. The infrared image showed skin, not clothing, the uniform gray tone of bare flesh rather than the varied tones that fabric produces under infrared illumination. No shoes, no gear, no equipment of any kind. Bare bodies running through the mountains in November at 23 inches the morning in temperatures that I checked against the weather data and that were 27 degrees Fahrenheit. The second photograph, captured 1 second later, showed the group further through the gap, the motion blur slightly different as the camera refocused, the figures now past center frame and heading toward the far edge of the detection zone. In this image, the rear figure was slightly clearer, the blur reduced enough that I could see more detail. The body was thin, lean in the way that animals are lean rather than humans, the musculature visible under the skin, with the definition that comes from sustained physical effort and minimal body fat. The skin appeared dark, but infrared images distort skin tones and I couldn't determine whether the darkness was pigmentation or dirt or the effect of the infrared spectrum on whatever covered their skin. The third photograph showed the trailing edge of the group exiting the detection zone, the last figure's legs visible at the right edge of the frame, the stride long and powerful, the foot striking the ground flat with the wide toe splay that I'd read about in other reports and that I was now seeing in my own images, the feet of something that runs barefoot on rough terrain, and that has done so long enough for the feet to adapt to the surface, the toes spreading wide for grip and balance, the soles calloused into a natural shoe that no manufactured footwear could replicate. 3 photographs, 3 seconds. The group had crossed the entire 20-foot detection zone in approximately 4 seconds, which meant they were running at approximately 15 miles per hour through a narrow gap on rough terrain in complete darkness. A fit human sprinter on a track can hit 25 miles per hour. These figures were doing 15 on a rocky mountain trail in the dark with no lights and no shoes in 27-degree weather. That's not impossible for a human, but it's not normal. And the posture, the forward lean, the extended arms, the naked bodies in freezing temperatures, all of it combined into something that was outside the range of human athletic performance, as I understood it. I enlarged the images. I adjusted the contrast and the brightness. I extracted every detail that the infrared sensor had captured. The blur limited what I could determine, but certain things were clear. The figures were adult-sized, all of them, no children visible in the group. Their body proportions were roughly human, but the limbs were long relative to the torso, the arms in particular extending further than standard human proportions would suggest. The heads were proportioned normally, but appeared to be positioned forward on the neck, thrust ahead of the body, leading the way an animal's head leads when it runs. The face pointed forward and down, oriented toward the trail rather than the horizon. I checked the camera. I went to the gap on Saturday afternoon, in daylight, and examined the camera and the trail and the terrain. The camera was functioning normally, no damage, no displacement. The trail through the gap showed prints, but the gap sees so much traffic that individual tracks are difficult to isolate, the ground compacted and overlaid with the prints of deer and coyotes and the hikers who occasionally pass through. I found nothing definitive on the ground that matched what the camera had captured. I've been checking the camera more frequently since November. Every week, sometimes twice a week, pulling the card and loading it, and scrolling through the images with an attention that has shifted from casual wildlife monitoring to focused surveillance of something that I know passes through my property and that I know the camera can capture if it passes through the gap again. I haven't captured another sequence. 8 months of weekly checks, and the camera shows deer and bear and coyote, and the occasional bobcat and nothing else. Whatever passed through the gap at 2:23 a.m. on a November Tuesday hasn't come back, or hasn't come through the gap, or has come through at a time when the camera wasn't functioning, or when they moved too fast even for the motion sensor to trigger. I keep the 3 photographs on my laptop. I've shown them to 2 people. Both of them looked at the images for a long time, and both of them said the same thing, which was that the blur made it impossible to identify the figures definitively. They could be runners, they could be hikers, they could be anything that is human-shaped and bipedal and running fast enough to blur in an infrared photograph. They could be, but they're not. Runners don't run naked through mountain gaps at 23 inches the morning in November in 27-degree weather. Hikers don't move through rough terrain at 15 miles per hour with no lights and no equipment. People don't run with their torsos horizontal and their arms extended forward and their feet splayed flat on the frozen ground. Something passed through the gap on my property on a November night, running in a formation that suggested a group traveling together with purpose and direction, moving with a speed and a posture that were outside the normal parameters of human locomotion. And the trail camera captured 3 photographs that show what passed through, blurred and imperfect and insufficient to prove anything to anyone who needs proof, but clear enough for me, who knows every animal that uses that gap, to know that what I'm looking at is not an animal, and is not a hiker, and is not a runner, and is something that moves through these mountains at night at speeds that shouldn't be possible, and in conditions that shouldn't be survivable. They passed through in 4 seconds, and they were gone. Into the dark, over the ridge, into whatever part of the mountain they were traveling to, and the camera reset and waited, and the next image was a deer at 4:47 a.m., and the world went back to normal. But they were there. For 4 seconds, at 2:23 a.m., they were there, and the camera saw them. And somewhere in these mountains, on some ridge or in some hollow or in some place that I'll never find, they're still running, still naked, still fast. Still passing through the gaps between the ridges in the dark hours, when the cameras are the only eyes and the forest is the only witness. And the gap is still open, and the camera is still watching. And one of these nights, they'll come through again. The 3 of us had been camping together for years, the kind of annual tradition that men in their 30s maintain as a connection to the version of themselves that existed before mortgages and careers, and the responsibilities that domesticate the wild impulses of youth. Marcus, Eric, and me, friends since college, gathering every October for a long weekend in the backcountry of the Cherokee National Forest in eastern Tennessee, 4 days of hiking and fishing and sleeping on the ground, and sitting around a fire talking about things that the rest of the year doesn't make room for. It was our ritual, our reset, the thing that kept us tethered to each other and to the mountains that we'd all grown up near enough to feel a claim on. The site we'd chosen for October of 2021 was one we'd used before, a backcountry camping area along a creek about 4 miles from the nearest trailhead. The trail followed the creek upstream through a narrow valley, the forest dense on both sides, the understory thick with rhododendron and hemlock, the terrain climbing gradually until the valley opened into a small, flat area beside the creek where the Park Service had designated a backcountry campsite. It was a good spot, level ground, water access, a fire ring built from creek stones by previous campers, and the particular isolation that comes from being 4 miles from the road on a trail that most people don't know exists. We arrived on a Wednesday afternoon and set up camp with the efficiency of people who've done it many times. 3 tents spaced in a loose triangle around the fire ring, the bear bags hung from a tree limb, the cook kit organized on a flat rock near the fire. The first 2 nights were uneventful. We fished the creek during the day, catching small rainbow trout that we released, and in the evenings we sat around the fire and ate the food we'd carried in and talked until the fire burned down and the cold drove us to our tents. The forest was quiet and the creek was audible, and the nights were dark with the particular density of darkness that the mountains produce in October, when the canopy is thinning but hasn't fully opened, and the sky is visible only in patches between the remaining leaves. The third night was different. I woke at midnight. I know the time because I checked my watch immediately, the way you do when you wake suddenly in the dark and need to anchor yourself to something measurable. The watch said 12:02. I was lying in my sleeping bag in my tent, fully awake, with the instant alertness of someone who has been woken not by a sound but by a change, A shift in the environment that penetrated sleep and triggered the system that exists beneath consciousness, the ancient alarm that wakes you when something in your surroundings has changed in a way that requires attention. I lay still and listened. The creak was audible, the constant murmur of water over stones that had been the background sound of the entire trip. The forest was quiet in the way that October forests are quiet at night. The insects mostly gone, the frogs silent, the nighttime activity reduced to the occasional owl, and the movement of small mammals in the leaf litter. Normal, expected. The acoustic profile of a backcountry site in the Cherokee National Forest in October, consistent with everything I'd heard for the previous 2 nights. Except the breathing. It came from below the camp, from the creek bottom, maybe 30 yards downhill through the rhododendron that grew along the banks. Multiple sources. Not one animal breathing, but several, 4 or 5 at minimum, producing the heavy, rapid respiration of large organisms that had recently been exerting themselves, the kind of breathing you hear from a dog that's been running or a person who's just climbed a hill. The breathing was loud enough to hear clearly through the tent fabric, loud enough to place directionally, and it was coming from the creek bed, from the exact area where the trail from the trailhead arrived at our camp, the only reasonable route in or out of the site. I heard a zipper, not mine. One of the other tents, Marcus or Eric, opening their tent from inside with the slow, deliberate sound of someone who is trying to be quiet and who is failing because zippers aren't quiet no matter how slowly you operate them. Then another zipper. Both of my friends had woken at the same time I had, which meant the change that had penetrated my sleep had penetrated theirs. All 3 of us pulled from unconsciousness simultaneously by whatever shift in the environment our sleeping brains had detected and flagged as requiring immediate wakefulness. None of us spoke. I don't know why. The normal response to waking in the night and hearing something would be to call out, to ask the others if they're awake, to establish communication among the group. None of us did. We lay in our separate tents in the dark and listened to the breathing from the creek bottom and didn't speak, as if the same instinct that had woken us was now instructing us to be silent, to observe without revealing ourselves, to not announce our wakefulness to whatever was breathing in the creek bed 30 yards away. The breathing continued, steady, heavy, multiple sources, positioned in the creek bottom at slightly different distances from the camp, the sound creating a rough spatial map of entities distributed along maybe 40 yards of creek bed. They were between us and the trail. I processed this fact with the particular clarity that fear provides, the calculation of escape routes that the brain performs automatically when the body has decided it's in a situation that might require escape. The trail was the only good route out. The creek bottom was the trail's approach to our camp. Whatever was down there was occupying the space we would need to cross to leave. Then the movement started, feet in water, the sound of something walking slowly in the shallow creek, the displacement of water around ankles or legs, the crunch of gravel beneath weight. Multiple sets of feet, moving slowly, not approaching the camp directly but moving along the creek bed, parallel to the slope on which we were camped, traversing the distance between the positions where the breathing had been. They were reorganizing, shifting positions, the formation in the creek bed adjusting itself with the deliberate coordination of entities that were communicating with each other in a way I couldn't hear. Except I could hear fragments. Between the breathing and the footsteps, between the sounds of water and stone, there were vocalizations, quiet, guttural, short exhalations that carried tonal variation, sounds that were too controlled and too varied to be simple breathing, but that weren't words and weren't language. They were signals, communication between the entities in the creek bed, brief and functional, conveying information about position or intention or something else that I couldn't decode but that the recipients clearly understood, because the movement in the creek bed would shift direction or pace in response to the sounds. I lay in my tent for 2 hours. 2 hours of breathing and footsteps, and the guttural vocalizations that rose from the creek bottom with the regularity of a patrol, the entities moving along the creek bed in a pattern that repeated, traversing the same stretch of water, passing through the same positions, as if they were pacing a boundary line that coincided with the approach to our camp, watching us, containing us, maintaining a perimeter that kept them between us and the trail while they did whatever they were doing in the creek bed in the dark. They left before dawn. The sounds diminished gradually, the breathing and the footsteps retreating downstream, moving away from the camp with the same slow deliberation that had characterized their movement all night. By 4 o'clock, the creek bottom was quiet, the only sound the water itself, running over the stones that had been walked on and displaced, and that held the evidence of the night's activity in their altered positions. Marcus spoke first. His voice came from his tent, low and hoarse. "Did you hear that?" Not a question, a confirmation. Eric answered from his tent with a single word. "Yes." I unzipped my tent and stepped out into the pre-dawn dark and stood in the camp and looked downhill toward the creek and saw nothing except the dark mass of rhododendron and the faint gray line of the creek where it caught the earliest trace of morning light. We went down to the creek at first light. The evidence was there. The creek bed, which had been a natural arrangement of water-worn stones when we'd walked through it on arrival, was disturbed. Stones displaced, rolled from their settled positions, the sandy banks on both sides showing prints, barefoot, human-shaped, multiple sizes. The prints showed the characteristics that I've since learned are associated with reports of this kind: the wide toe splay, the flat foot contact, the absence of heel strike. The walking pattern was unusual. The prints didn't follow the creek bed in straight lines the way a person walking through a creek would walk. They crossed and recrossed, the paths of multiple entities, weaving through each other in a pattern that looked like pacing, like patrol, like the systematic coverage of a defined area by multiple individuals following a predetermined route. We packed up and hiked out that morning. 4 miles of trail through the forest, the creek beside us, the rhododendron close on both sides, the terrain that had felt welcoming on the hike in, now feeling like a corridor that something else controlled. We didn't run, we didn't panic. We walked at a steady pace, and we kept our voices low, and we reached the trailhead and the truck, and drove away, and none of us spoke for the first 20 minutes of the drive. We've talked about it since, many times. We've tried to explain it with bears, with people, with coyotes, with the acoustic distortions that mountain terrain produces at night. None of the explanations hold. Bears don't patrol in groups. People don't walk barefoot in a creek bed in October in the middle of the night. Coyotes don't make guttural vocalizations that sound like communication between primates. And the footprints in the sand were real and human-shaped, and showed a gait that none of us could replicate when we tried. We don't go back to that site. We still camp, still do our October trip, but we choose sites that are closer to the trailhead, closer to the road, closer to the world that we understand, and that operates on rules we can predict. We gave up the deep backcountry, because what we heard in the creek bottom that night told us that the deep backcountry is occupied, that the isolation we sought and enjoyed was not isolation at all, but proximity, nearness to something that lives in the remote drainages and the creek bottoms in the forest where the trail doesn't go, something that came to our camp in the dark and breathed and walked and watched us for 2 hours, and left before dawn, and that will be there the next time someone makes camp in that clearing and falls asleep to the sound of the creek, trusting the darkness to hold nothing more than what the darkness should hold. They watched us, from the creek bottom, in the dark, for 2 hours, breathing, moving, communicating in sounds that were not language, but that carried meaning, positioned between us and the way out. And in the morning, the footprints in the sand, barefoot and human-shaped and wrong, told us what we already knew. We'd been visited by something that was curious enough to come close and patient enough to stay, and wise enough to leave before we could see what it was. And the creek runs on, and the campsite sits empty, and the forest holds what it holds. And somewhere in the dark, in the drainages where the trails don't go, something breathes and watches and waits for the next set of tents to appear in the clearing that it considers its territory. And it's patient. Whatever it is, whatever they are, they're patient. And the mountains are old enough and big enough and dark enough to hold their patience for as long as it takes. I retired from the United States Forest Service in 2021 after 32 years as a forestry technician in the Monongahela National Forest, which means I spent the better part of my adult life walking the mountains of eastern West Virginia, monitoring timber stands and wildlife populations and trail conditions, and the general health of a forest that covers over 900,000 acres of some of the most rugged terrain in the Appalachian chain. The Monongahela is not a park. It's a working forest, managed for multiple uses, timber and recreation, and watershed protection and wildlife habitat. And the people who work in it develop a relationship with the land that goes beyond what any visitor experiences, a knowledge that accumulates over decades of walking the same ridges in every season and every weather and every state of light, until the forest becomes less a place you go to and more a place you inhabit, a second home that holds as many of your memories as the house you sleep in. I know things about the Monongahela that I've never put in a report. That's a statement that requires context, because the Forest Service generates enormous amounts of documentation, timber inventories and wildlife surveys and fire reports and trail assessments, and the constant paperwork that federal land management produces. I've contributed to thousands of these documents over 3 decades. I'm a meticulous observer and a careful recorder, and I believe in the institutional mission of documenting what the forest contains and how it changes over time. But there are things that don't fit in the forms. Observations that fall outside the categories that the reporting system accommodates. Things I've seen and heard and found that would, if reported, generate questions I can't answer and conclusions I'm not prepared to defend, so I didn't report them. I noted them in my personal field journals, which I've kept since my first year of service, and I carried them in my memory, and I retired with them unspoken. I'm speaking now because I'm 71 years old, and the things I know should be known by someone besides me before I'm not around to know them anymore. In the last decade of my career, roughly 2011 to 2021, I became aware of a pattern of activity in a remote section of the forest on the eastern side of the Allegheny Plateau in the headwaters of a drainage that I'm not going to identify more specifically than that. The section was among the most remote in the forest, accessible only by unmarked trails that weren't on any public map, terrain so steep and so densely forested that it received almost no recreational use, and that even the timber crews avoided because the slopes were too severe for harvesting equipment. The first signs I noticed were footprints. I was doing a winter wildlife survey in January of 2012, walking a transect through snow that was about 6 inches deep, when I crossed a set of tracks that I couldn't identify. They were barefoot, human-shaped, showing 5 toes and an arch and a heel, but with the wide toe splay that I've since learned is characteristic of feet that have never worn shoes. The toes spread to their natural width, the spaces between them as wide as the toes themselves. The prints were pressed deep into the snow, suggesting significant body weight, and they showed the flat, even foot contact of something that walks without the heel strike that shoe-wearing humans develop, the entire sole contacting the ground at once. The tracks appeared in the middle of the transect, in snow that had fallen overnight and that showed no other disturbance. They emerged from the forest on one side of my path, crossed it in 4 strides, and disappeared into the forest on the other side. No approach trail, no departure trail, just 4 prints in the snow, as if whatever made them had materialized on one side of the path, crossed it, and dematerialized on the other. I checked the surrounding snow for continuation of the tracks and found nothing. The prints existed in isolation, 4 steps in virgin snow, going from nowhere to nowhere. Over the following years, I found more signs. Not frequently, not in every visit, but often enough that a pattern emerged. Footprints in snow and soft ground, always barefoot, always showing the wide splay and the flat contact. Shelters, small structures built from forest materials, branches and bark and moss assembled into lean-tos and windbreaks, tucked into rock overhangs and cave mouths, positioned in the most inaccessible terrain available, places where a person would have to climb or scramble to reach. The shelters were not permanent. They were built, used, and abandoned. The materials left to decay, while new shelters appeared in different locations, a rotating pattern of habitation that suggested a population moving through the forest on a circuit, occupying temporary camps and moving on. Kill sites, places where deer and bear carcasses had been butchered with tools that left marks I couldn't match to any implement I knew. Not the clean cuts of a steel knife or the ragged tears of a predator's teeth. These were marks made by stone or bone, the characteristic crushing and scraping that primitive tools produce, the kind of butchering marks that archaeologists find on bones from prehistoric sites. The butchering was skilled, efficient, showing a knowledge of anatomy that allowed the butcher to disarticulate joints and strip meat with minimal waste. Whoever was doing this knew how to process a carcass and had been doing it long enough to develop expertise. The activity was seasonal. In spring, summer, and fall, the signs were distributed across the higher elevations, the ridges and the upper drainages, where the forest was densest and the terrain was most remote. In winter, When the snow deepened and the temperatures dropped and the high ridges became impassable, the signs moved. They didn't disappear. They moved downhill, concentrating in the lower elevations, in the hollows where the terrain provided shelter from wind and snow, and where the geological features of the landscape offered something that the open forest didn't. I found the entrance in February of 2018. I was following a set of winter tracks through a hollow in the drainage, tracks that were clearer than usual because the snow was fresh and deep and the prints were well defined. The tracks led to the back of the hollow, to a rock face where a cliff of sandstone rose vertically from the hollow floor, and at the base of the cliff, partially hidden by a rhododendron thicket, was an opening. A crack in the rock, maybe 3 feet wide and 5 feet high, leading into darkness. The tracks went in. I could see the prints in the snow, leading to the opening and continuing on the bare rock inside, mud on stone, the impressions of bare feet on a surface that they had walked many times before. I went in, not far, maybe 50 feet, far enough for my flashlight to show me what the entrance corridor contained. The passage was natural, a fissure in the sandstone that had been widened by water dissolution, and that continued into the rock at a slight downward angle. The walls showed hand and footholds that had been worn into the stone by repeated use, smooth depressions where hands had gripped and feet had pushed, the surface polished by the oils of skin contacting rock over years or decades of travel. The ceiling was blackened with soot in places, the residue of fires that had been built in the passage, the smoke staining the rock above with a layer of carbon that was thick enough to suggest many fires over a long period. The floor of the passage showed the detritus of habitation, bones, animal bones, cracked for marrow, the fragments pushed to the sides of the passage the way you push debris to the edges of a path you walk regularly. Ash from fires, mixed with the dirt and the sand of the cave floor. And the smell, organic, musky, the concentrated scent of human bodies living in a confined space, the biological residue of a population that occupied this passage regularly, and that left its olfactory signature in the rock, the way it left its soot on the ceiling and its polish on the handholds. The passage continued deeper. My flashlight showed it descending into the mountain, the angle steepening, the walls narrowing and then widening again, the geology creating a corridor that went down into the earth with the steady grade of a path that was going somewhere specific, a route that had been traveled enough to wear smooth, the surfaces that hands and feet contacted, and to deposit a continuous layer of soot and ash and biological residue along its length. I didn't go further. I stood in the passage 50 feet from daylight, and I listened to what came from deeper in the mountain. Air, moving, carrying warmth from below, the temperature underground stabilizing as depth increases, the constant 55 degrees that caves maintain regardless of the surface conditions, and sound, faint, distant, rising from the depths with the warm air, the sound of movement and the sound of vocalizations, the guttural, rapid communications that I'd heard reported but never heard myself until that moment, the sound of something alive and social and organized, talking to each other in the dark depths of a mountain that they'd been living inside for longer than anyone had been tracking their presence on the surface. This is where they go in winter. This is the answer to the question that I'd been asking for years. The question of how something that lives in the forest survives the winters that these mountains produce, the months of deep snow and sub-zero temperatures that drive everything else to shelter or to death. They go underground, into the caves and the passages that the geology provides, into the earth where the temperature is constant and the wind can't reach, and the snow doesn't fall, and the darkness is absolute and permanent and home. I sealed the entrance in my mind. I didn't report it. I didn't mark it on any map. I walked out of the hollow and hiked back to my truck and drove home and wrote the location in my personal journal in a code that only I can read, and I've never been back. They go underground in winter. They descend into the mountain through passages they've been using for generations, following paths worn smooth by the bare feet of ancestors who found these caves when the surface world was still wild and who never left, who adapted to the underground the way their surface relatives adapted to houses and farms and the technological civilization that grew up around them while they remained in the mountains, in the forests, in the caves, following the old way, the way that predates everything we've built and that continues beneath it. I know where they go. I know the entrance. I know the passage and the handholds and the soot on the ceiling and the bones on the floor and the sound that rises from the depths when you stand in the corridor and listen. And I'm telling you this not because I want anyone to go there. I'm telling you this because I'm 71 years old, and the knowledge shouldn't die with me, and because the things that live in these mountains deserve to be known, even if the knowing changes nothing. They're there, in the forest in summer and in the caves in winter, walking the ridges and the hollows, butchering deer with stone tools, building shelters in the rock overhangs, communicating in sounds that aren't language, raising children who will never see a road or a town or a school, living the way humans lived before everything changed, in the mountains that were here before us and that will be here after us, and that hold in their stone interiors the evidence of a way of life that the modern world believes ended thousands of years ago. It didn't end. It went underground, and every spring it comes back to the surface, and every winter it goes back down, and the mountains keep the cycle, the way mountains keep everything, patiently, silently, in the dark that only the mountains provide. I know where they go in winter, and now you do too.